Now for something completely different, as they say in Monty Python. But I'm not going to do funny walks. I'm going to first of all thank you for inviting me to this meeting. I was last in Ottawa over 20 years ago as a naive ecologist accompanying a UK delegation, talking to Canadian and other regulators and civil servants about how we were going to exchange information about GM crops. So it's nice to be back after 20 years. I was naive, I was breathtakingly naive. I actually couldn't understand why organic farmers wouldn't want to have crops that were protected in such a way that they didn't have to put pesticides on them. So that's where I started. So I've been disabused of that for a long time, of course. What I want to talk to you about is problem formulation. Now, this is what you've asked me to talk about. Clearly, I can't do it in 20 minutes. So what I'm going to do is start off with the take-home messages, because then at least I'll have got what I want to say across. I'll have to do a very quick tutorial on problem formulation, mainly giving you some references and some of what I think are important concepts. And I'll just say a little bit at the end about unintended environmental effects, because these also happen. Right, let's have a look at some take-home messages. They're very simple. Because when you're dealing with environmental risk assessment for GM crops, you're more or less dealing all the time with the phenotype. I say almost because there are occasions, of course, when you'd be interested in the heritability of the gene, things to do with expression and to do with the evolution of pest resistance. Environmental risk assessment considers all the traits altered by transformation. So these traits have been characterized, of course, as we've heard, during this long process of growing trials and product development. Whatever the information's been collected for, whether for agronomic performance or to test some specific idea, there's a lot of data to enable us to look at the traits that we're interested in. And therefore, environmental risk assessment, which starts with the environment, I should probably say this several times and not the plant, thus embraces both intended and unintended effects of transformation. So, the sort of traits which you might be interested in, Alina used a very nice phrase, I thought, which was significant and meaningful. If you found significant and meaningful differences as an ecologist in any of these sorts of traits, these regeneration niche traits, the dormancy, the development of the seed, shattering, and so on, the rates of germination, or any of the traits which affect the vigor and competitiveness of the plant during these trials, you'd be interested in those. But in general, rather like the model we've just been hearing about for food, there's a sort of family of effects without which you would be alerted were they very, very different from anything you'd ever come across before. And this needs a biological context, of course, some common sense about natural history. I'd worked for many years, in fact until I came to Ottawa almost, on wild plants. These are plants with real teeth. These are real competitors. These guys know what they're doing out there. And if you recognise anything out there which is of interest to you as having changed your crop in such a way, then that's when it alerts you to do an environmental risk assessment. So data from these trials can often be used to test some of the general hypotheses you might make about the impact of transformation. Would the modified crop be more weedy or invasive is one of the Canadian pillars, the first one I think, Phil, is it? And you need to think in terms of common sense. And what would you have to do to maize to make it weedy and invasive? I mean, how far outside the biology of maize would the new plant have to be before it became a weedy and invasive plant? You might say something different for canola. That's a different sort of plant. It's an ill-bred creature comparatively. And you'll need further data, of course, to test specific hypotheses. And Jorg Remeis is going to talk to us about those in relation to things like effects on MTOs. But for the unintended, the unexpected, there's an awful lot of data you can use from this sort of process. So, the second lot of take-home messages are that the environmental risk assessment, what it's about is considering those effects of cultivating the plant on a large scale. So you've now got, from all the trials you've done in the lab and in the field, the plant as part of your agriculture. And what problem formulation aims to do is to identify those effects, among the many effects this plant will have, which may cause harm, and to devise a plan to analyse the risk of this harm being realised. That, very, very briefly, is what it's about. However you do it, and it can be done very formally, or whether it's just a thinking process, that's what problem formulation aims to do. And of course, some outcomes of this large-scale cultivation, whether it's a GM or a non-GM, whether it's negative, whether it's actually beneficial, they will be unintended, and in a way which I'll talk about later on. Problem formulation's job is to try and capture those of these unintended effects which are potentially harmful. Okay, well, a little tutorial in problem formulation. If you could do such a thing, I would have worn this slide out because I love it so much. It's from Ryan Hill's paper about the structure of risk assessment frameworks. The hazard identification bit at the beginning, what could go wrong, the exposure assessment, how likely is it to go wrong, and the consequences. Would it be a problem? And the thing which we've seen in several talks already is that risk characterization is what's the risk, and that's some sort of function of exposure and the seriousness of the hazard. So that's really rather nice. And the schematic of the environmental risk assessment after the US EPA shows you where problem formulation sits in all this process. Right at the beginning here, it's sort of hazard identification plus a few other things. And I'm going to use some of these terms just to illustrate the way in which it's approached. Okay, so you've still got exposure, hazard, and risk characterization. This particular one, which I call the ILSI Framework, is just a more complicated version of that, which divides this process into the context of the problem and the definition of the problem. But it's essentially the same. It helps you to characterize the risk by looking at the likelihood of exposure and the consequences of exposure. And that particular formal paper, which I put a reference on the memory stick, gives you some of these terms. I just want to use some of these terms as I go through what the concept of problem formulation is. You start out there in the environment. You start to look for protection goals. These are the things that you want to protect, and they're usually defined, often very loosely, by environmental objectives, by local statutes, by law, by policy. It could be the Cartagena Protocol. It could be something to do with a local nature reserve. These are the things which define the things which you want to protect, which you don't want to harm. And these, as somebody has said already, are not defined by science. And from these, you can actually derive some assessment endpoints, which are those things out there that you don't want to harm, that they must be protected, and they have with them an attribute, so that it might be that beneficial insect abundance would be an assessment endpoint, which you could measure. You could measure if the abundance of beneficial insects providing some ecosystem service declined, you would have some measure that you had caused a harm that you'd recognise. So, for example, protection goal might be the conservation of insect pollinators. We're very worried in Europe and elsewhere about bumblebees. So an assessment endpoint that you might recognise would be the abundance of bumblebees. So you might ask yourself, could growing this crop impact on the abundance of bumblebees? Or it might be that you want weed-free crops, and your protection goal is to do with a good agriculture, and the assessment endpoint would be measurable as the abundance of weeds in the field. So when you've got to that stage, you then generate what we've called here an exposure scenario or a pathway to harm. You need some way of linking, either mentally or formally, the growing of the crop to the thing that you don't want to harm, the thing that you're trying to protect. This is the pathway to harm, which Alan Rabel referred to. And you can get to this pathway by a set of risk hypotheses. These are explanations taken to be true for the purpose of argument, and they're usually expressed negatively. As Alan told us very elegantly, with regard to Popper, you can only invalidate these things. You can't actually prove them going looking for white swans. And you can do this with simple conceptual models, or at least they can be simple like this. Here the The thing we're worried about is that herbicide-tolerant soybean might displace species out there in the wild in the natural habitat, or they might be displaced valued species. So you can look at growing the crop, it's producing seed, it disperses to natural habitats, it establishes, it spreads more than the non-herbicide tolerant counterpart, and does what you're looking for it not to do. And you can set up these risk hypotheses. Well, you can probably cut it off at the path here if you find that it doesn't establish any more in natural habitats. And what you would do in order to test this in your mind or on paper is to look at the comparative performance of herbicide-tolerant and non-herbicide-tolerant soybeans for these sort of unintended effects during product development. Is it more weedy? Have you any significant and meaningful way of saying, well, that's going to behave differently out there in the wild? So this is the way of getting to the harm from the growing of the crop. Sometimes they can be quite complex. This is quite a famous bit of work on monarch butterfly. Mark Sears and colleagues showed that actually the exposure part of that equation is contingent upon things to do with the distribution of the butterfly, to do with the corn and when it's growing and when it's producing pollen, as well as to do with the actual food plant. So that whatever the lethality or not of the harm, of the hazard, exposure to it is dependent upon these sorts of things. So models can be quite complex occasionally. Okay, so if you want to look at these sorts of frameworks and some of the definitions involved, I draw your attention to this Volt et al. Paper. I realise I've missed Moises Baruchek out there, but that's the paper which lays out the schema I showed you earlier on. And also I have to recommend this. You recognise buckets and searchlights from this young man who has made a huge contribution in adapting this very well-established form of risk assessment problem formulation to the special case of GM crops. And you'll find in this paper of Alan's quite a lot of references to his earlier work. So my exceedingly more modest contributions have included recasting this process as 4 questions, thinking about what we used to do, sitting down in committees, trying to advise the government. And the first thing we said was, well, what don't we want to see harm? What is it we're trying to protect? Start out there. Don't start with the crop and all its characteristics and all its traits. Start with what's in the environment and what you want to protect. Secondly, can we envision a way in which there could be harm? Can we link the growing of the crop to a harm that might be realised? Thirdly, how can we assess how likely that is to happen? Can we think of a plan? Can we think of some data that will help us to test this? And finally, does it matter? What's the regulatory context? And this is all in matching. You can see it reads across very nicely to the process within the formal problem formulation methodology. So asking what we don't want to see harm is looking at these assessment endpoints from our various statutes and laws. Trying to envision a way in which it would be harm is tracing these pathways, perhaps developing a model to help us do this. Assessing whether they're likely to be harmed could be formulate risk hypotheses and coming up with a plan to test these hypotheses. They're not hypotheses in the scientific sense, they're things that you need to validate, or to invalidate. And then does it matter? What's the regulatory context? That's also, of course, nothing to do with science. The science is in this middle bit, is understanding how there might be an impact from growing the crop. And you can find all that stuff in that paper, which is also on the memory stick. And can I also recommend this from Wendy Craig and her colleagues, who, along with several people in this room, have been developing and helping people to develop very simple regulatory systems, not using necessarily the formal aspects of problem formulation, in fact not using the sort of negative invalidation form, but actually helping people, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere, to develop simple regulatory systems that ask these very important questions. The logic's the same, it doesn't matter about whether you use the right language here. Okay. Let me finish by talking about unintended environmental effects. Now, large-scale cultivation of crops is likely to have novel effects from novel crops and is arising from the way you manage it or from new varieties. Farming's a harmful and dangerous business, and it changes the environment we live in. And although I don't want to get too involved in semantics, of course, some of these effects will be unintended in the sense that they're unplanned. They're not unanticipated, but you want to avoid them. They might be the evolution of pest resistance, or they might be the evolution of herbicide-tolerant weeds or something. They're not unforeseen, but it isn't the deliberate intention of the grower that they should happen. So in that very narrow sense, they're unintended. But we can anticipate there'll be lots of other unintended effects in the sense that they were totally unexpected. We just didn't see them coming. They're a product of what we did when we decided to grow this particular crop. And what problem formulation aims to do is to pick up as many of these that we can foresee and identify the possible harmful effects, because the purpose of it all is to make a tool for decision making about whether you cultivate the crop, how you cultivate it, where you cultivate it, what risk mitigation measures you may take, and so on and so forth. So there are unintended environmental effects, and it's important to realise that changes occur and they happen all the time, and we must get the scale right. These changes have actually happened in the UK in my lifetime. I'm not actually in that picture, but I have as a small boy in the 1940s ridden on the top of haystacks and worked with horses on my uncle's farm. And we've seen these changes from haystacks to bales to mainly silage, and from very species-rich permanent pastures and meadows full of flowers to temporary layers of ryegrass and clover happen in the last 50 to 60 years. Huge changes too in the way in which we deal with our crops and our cereal crops. I can remember stouking barley from this Van Gogh picture, and the way in which we've moved from spring sown to winter sown crops. Also in dairy and beef production, a general trend within the UK from having animals grazing out there in the pasture and the range to standing on concrete and feeding them forage, maize and silage and the rest of it. These are huge changes which have gone on without anybody throwing their hands up in horror and saying, what are we doing? We're changing our agriculture. Until, of course, they notice, as we would expect, huge changes in those things that we regard as biodiversity. For example, if you use those birds that depend on farmland as an indicator of biodiversity, this line shows you what's happened to farmland species since 1970 to 2000 in the UK. Other species of birds, we've got about the same numbers of different species. There's been some declining woodland species, but many farmland species, and particularly iconic birds like the skylark, have declined. And people then sort of say, well, gosh, we've got to change back, we've got to do something. And of course, that's what we do in Europe now. We pay farmers through entry-level schemes and agri-environment schemes to try and farm in ways which are wildlife friendly. We try to get them to put hedges back. We want to try and bring back some of the birds. I was at a very interesting conference recently at which we looked at the aspects of how these entry-level schemes, these new ways of agri-environment farming, were bringing birds back. And one of the most interesting findings that's emerging is that you have to be, as we expected, fairly specific for specific species. So some species have declined because of hedgerows, some species have declined because we've got bigger fields, some species because we don't leave seed in the stubble, and some species because we don't have insects in the borders of the fields. So we really do need, as a challenge, to understand more about what controls these species. So, not all unexpected changes are of course, environmentally harmful. I don't suppose when Canadian canola growers adopted with great enthusiasm all these herbicide-tolerant varieties, when they went from 0 to over 90% herbicide tolerance, they intended to change very much for the better the conditions of cultivation that go on in the Canadian canola fields. So we've gone from a situation with no-till being very small to being almost half of of the way in which farmers farm, and the conservation of soil microbes, the carbon sequestering and so on, all the environmental implications of that sort of activity, was in that sense an unintended effect. So I think I'll finish with that, because that's nicely Canadian and makes, I hope, a nice point about the fact that we expect change. It's defining how we deal with it that's the important thing.